Daniel,
OG
OG Rose,
Rose.
and tonight we're going to talk about what Michelle's thinking about. So, Michelle,
Woohoo.
what you thinking about?
Well, I guess there's two main things that come to mind. One is that, we're expecting our fourth baby, and so I've been kind of in this nesting mode, which is hard to describe. I mean, you can know stereotypically what that means for women if you've ever heard of this concept. But basically, it's like when you're about to give birth, you maybe clean things more. You might make more food to preserve it. Just random things that you've neglected. Maybe you suddenly are like, I want to get the bugs out of the lamp. And you feel more of this like strange it's like there's something that's deeply biological about it, because it's like it does feel like some I don't want to say it's like out of your control, but you feel very compelled. It's like this, suddenly you're doing it, and why hadn't you done it for so long? Like you're doing something that probably needed to be done anyway, and you weren't doing it. Then suddenly in the nesting phase, you're doing it.
Yeah.
You just find yourself doing it. And it's interesting because it's kind of like, it's a time of cultivating the space itself. Like maybe your body has been the incubation space for the child, and then when you know that you're bringing them into your home, there's a sense of like that becoming the space you need to prepare, or something like that. But it's a very, very interesting thing, and I have been meditating on what that means, or what that could sort of do in terms of like an analogy for the creative process. So anyways, I've been thinking about that.
I actually think it's a fascinating topic, because, we were talking at the Net Thursday about absolute choice and absolute letting, and this idea of the absolute choice needing to choose the space where you let, something like beauty push you into the feedback loop or a story, as opposed to choosing it yourself, because that's without going too much into that, that's like a super dilemma of how does the person, if you're the birdie and donkey, between two equally piled, equally sized piles of grain.
Right.
The donkey starves because it can't make a choice.
Right.
And the idea of the absolute letting, which you can have this kind of Hegel, Hume, Heidegger kind of notion put together with storytelling, as Luber talks about, is the idea that actually there's a way where you choose to stand between the piles, believing that there's an external force beyond you that will push you into a decision without you having to make one. And that's actually the best kind of decision, because it's not reducible to the ego. It feels the most meaningful. It feels like you're most fitting. It feels like the force that's external to you that you can't describe. Maybe it's beauty. Maybe it's telos. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's we were saying if the whole body thinks, like Seth talks about, then your body will actually make a choice without your consciousness making a choice. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of the things that people find most meaningful, they don't feel like they chose. They feel like they chose them. Philip Reeve has that incredible line where he says, human beings don't want to choose, they want to feel like they're chosen. And you see, a lot of times when people talk about the meaning crisis, it actually is part of the problem is where you're looking to be chosen, but all you can ever do is make choices. Capitalism gives you choices, but it removes social mechanisms of feeling chosen. Yeah. And what's very interesting about the nesting example you're giving there is there's almost a feeling of, correct me if I'm wrong, almost feeling fitting, or almost kind of chosen, like there's a kind of force you're responding to that's not reducible to your egotistical choices, right? That kind of decision is actually what human beings are looking for. We found you feel most free in this thing that also feels like you're compelled, right? It's this weird thing. Exactly. I'd be curious, any comments on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great connection. And I do think that the phenomenological experience is quite, I would say there's an odd sort of freedom, because in that kind of experience, because in a way it's almost like you're doing it thoughtlessly, but you're doing it there's an intention, and there's obviously you have to think about, for example, if you're organizing a closet, what are you keeping, what are you not keeping, you have to, in a sense, like you have to have the original thought to do it, but that thought kind of seems to come, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but it just sort of appears.
Yeah.
And then you're doing it.
Yeah.
And there's a strange kind of, like you're saying, that odd way of the bothness of it, the odd way that it's both you doing something you don't feel like you're in control of, but also that you feel a strange freedom in it, like as if you are meant to be doing it because you've been chosen to do this
Yep.
this role or
That
this
that
task.
feeling is what humans want. That
Yeah.
is the whatever the the quote unquote address to the problems of belonging again, the meaning crisis, all of that for the human being is a feeling like that.
And I think what's unique about it in terms of it being so closely linked to the biology and this this kind of intimate, well, for the role of motherhood as that intimate role, because I was just thinking to myself, maybe this is why people do like jobs
Yep.
in general, because it's kind of like I do my thing,
Yep.
I do the thing that I'm told to do, and
Fittedness. There's a certain fittedness
right.
to it.
But I think what's unique about this particular the scenario of the mother, though I don't think that it's necessarily so different with a job potentially, though there are some.
But a job can feel arbitrary and oppressive, whereas there's
Right.
something about nesting that feels kind of like the muse and mysterious.
Yeah, well, and also like you're not paid to do it. Like
Yes.
you just do it because again, it's the fittedness of the situation. Like
Yes.
and you suddenly find yourself doing it.
Yes.
Like it's just I guess that's what I was really thinking about, like meditating about. I was like, you just find yourself doing this thing.
Yes.
And then you're like, I just cleaned out this whole closet, and
The problem of motivation vanishes. The problem of
Exactly, the
laziness
problem of-
vanishes.
suddenly, and it's funny how it comes, right, when you're it's also a time when sometimes you think about like, oh well, you need a rest,
Yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
but maybe your body's like, well, I'm gonna, if I'm it's almost this sort of like ramp up of preparation, because then you like the arc of it is you prepare, then you labor, then you rest in the healing phase.
Sure.
And everything needs to be prepared because right after you've birthed, you're not like you're healing and you're nursing your baby and familiarizing yourself with the baby and them everyone to the baby and the home, and you're like, it wouldn't be appropriate to do the nesting activities
Sure.
right after the baby's born. If it just, but you also won't, like, it's just so interesting because the way that you're talking about with this motivation is like, oh, it just suddenly you're doing the thing, there's this ramp up of doing things, of cleaning, tidying, cooking,
Yes.
things like this, and those things just, it's like a flow of it.
Yes. Well,
But those, it doesn't come after, it comes in this beautiful rhythm of an order, with when laboring's happening and then the rest.
Sure. I mean, there's a
resting.
way in which there's also something interesting about the rest being the order. I mean, a lot of times people use the word rest and sleep together, right?
Yeah.
What's very interesting is they're kind of different. Actually, the nesting is part of the rest.
Exactly, because
Yes.
that's the thing. There's a strange feeling of like, it's a restful work.
Yes.
It's a very, very strange sensation of like,
But that's
feeling
meaningful
quite
work.
restful
Yeah.
work.
I mean, when people do
It's-
work that they find meaningful or passionate, it's
Yeah.
not. It's very interesting because it doesn't fall into a simple binary of energy tired.
And it's hard because I can think about the creative, like let's say
Yes.
if you're writing, okay, and this is a dynamic I think that can be felt with creative works. I really do, because it's like you get into that phase where suddenly something shows up, right? Like I said, this idea suddenly it shows up that you're cleaning a closet. I need to clean this closet. Somehow there's this compelling feeling of I need to do this, and I'm going to do this. And then you do it. You just suddenly do it. You find yourself in this flow of doing it. And then you afterwards you're like, where did that all come from?
Yeah.
Or how did that all happen?
Yep.
Something that usually would have been like, just take, like you said, having to motivate yourself or having to even think, yeah, you should be doing that. It's like all of that goes out the window, and it's not applicable to the experience of the flow, right? The
Correct.
flow is that you don't have to, there's no question of motivation, it's just happening. But the thing is that, really quick, the interesting thing is that, oh my gosh, I lost my thought. But I think what I was trying to say is that with that's what I was going to say. People can look into that and just think, oh, that looks so easy for them, right? Because we have this strange relationship with work rest,
We're
work
very
rest.
confused.
So then we just think, oh, they just like, it must be like, when you just attribute it to being like a hobby or you just want to. But it's like, no, there is a type of, like the scriptures will say, kind of feeling, the yoke is easy, the burden is light, kind of feeling to it. But it's not as if it's not actual work. It is, but somehow in that flow state, you don't feel it to be. And yet it still takes some, it takes that willingness, I guess, to be there to do it.
I mean,
So I don't know. It's interesting.
I mean, you also got to get pregnant, right? I mean, you also have to make choices, right? But what you're describing is very isomorphic with the creative act, because the true, I think the true creative will say they don't choose it. The act is upon them. They make choices to be in the position for it to occur.
Exactly.
Just like you make choices to be pregnant, but also there's a mysterious connection, a high order causation between, say, pregnancy or the choice to be in a relationship in which pregnant, you even have to go further back.
Yeah, sure.
Is that there's not a straight line between the cause and effect of the flow state per se.
Yeah.
But because you make certain choices that might have been hard to make, you put yourself in the place where this mysterious motivation emerges.
Yes.
So in a way, it is up to your agency, but at the same time it's not, right? And this is what's very interesting, is human beings are searching for something like this. This is what humans want. They don't merely want freedom from, so Isaiah Berlin talks about freedom from, freedom to.
Right.
Freedom, where I'm free from oppression, but then there's also the freedom to get a hamburger.
Right.
And we tend to, especially in America, locate our lives between freedom from and freedom to. Mm-hmm. Humans want freedom in. We want to feel free in something, right? But the funny thing is, you feel free in something that carries you. Like, because otherwise you're doing all the calculation, all the thinking. You're not free from your own thinking. This is what's very interesting. In the nesting act, in the creative act, there's a way in which your deliberation about should I even be doing this, you don't think, you're just doing it. You're free from the deliberation.
Absolutely.
And that's where humans are happy. Humans are not happy when they have to think about everything. We are creatures, beings who find happiness in this very interesting middle place between agency and, well, you could say agency and flow. Yeah. Agency and necessity. The flow state of nesting only happens because you use your agency to be in a relationship and to make choices where you're pregnant to be nesting. So you are responsible for the nesting, but then in the experience of the nesting, you don't experience yourself as responsible. Yeah. That kind of schema is what humans need. Yeah. And the creative act, likewise, the artist makes choices that put them in a position to have the muse show up. But the particular moment when the muse shows up, they don't choose. And once it shows up, they don't find themselves deliberating. They just find themselves in the flow. Yeah. This is what humans want. Yeah. Yeah. This is what makes humans happy.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think that it makes me wonder if
fulfilled might be a better word than happy. Joyous, but that's what this is what humans see.
It's what makes people feel like they live
alive.
A meaningful life.
Yeah.
That they have they feel that deep resonance with meaning. You know, and there it does. Yeah, and it's interesting because two things came to mind. One is the determination. What I mean to say is that it seems like it seems that you have to accept. I mean, we know this concept quite well, and you discuss it quite well, Daniel. But there's having to accept the determined for your freedom, right?
Yeah, that's big with Hegel. So, the identification with the determination.
Exactly,
yes.
And I think that's really kind of
it.
Yeah, and that's what is happening, I think, in pregnancy, right? Like, is that you're in a sense, you've kind of like accepted a limitation, right, or a type of determination by your own biology. Right, and what leads, like, what result, what is the end result of the act that is impregnating, and then you are now taken over by that.
Yes.
Which is you're like not. It's like you're very much not free.
Yes.
But yet you were free to make the choice in the first place. It's like this oscillation between free, not free, now free flow. And it's like and. I think that's a beautiful illustration of Hegel's point, really, honestly. And I think that it's those types of things where, like, you really allow yourself to be taken over.
Yes.
Which it quite literally is a type of.
Yes.
I think think it's an appropriate language. I mean, it's a little strong, but it is a kind of takeover for pregnancy. You're allowing your body to become the home for another life, and and that's your process to be the vessel for that. And the same with writing. Well, really, one last thing, really quick. With the creative act, what I'm thinking about now too is allowing it to fully take over. Mm-hmm. When you have those doubt questions or those qualm questions of like, why am I even doing this? Da da da. You're not there yet. You haven't like let yourself get taken over by it enough.
No.
You didn't let it take you over.
Yeah.
And I'm not. It's not like a don't you feel shame in that. It's actually important because then you can realize, oh, that's why I'm still struggling with all those questions.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's like a kind of creative control and birth control, right? Like,
absolutely.
So you're still in the act of deliberation, and if you're in the act of deliberation, it can't take you over. The taking over flow requires the absolute choice, the giving yourself over.
You're free to give away all your freedom.
Yeah.
So that you can get to the place of the freedom flow.
Yeah. I don't think it's by chance though that notably in the West, and I don't even think the concept of freedom in is extremely pronounced in the East. The categories of freedom to and freedom from are masculine. Freedom in is much more feminine, and without feminine thinking and philosophy, you get this third category is lost, and so then, unfortunately, ideas of how to fix nihilism can often be situated between questions of freedom in and freedom from. Not necessarily. I'm not saying everyone makes that mistake, but there's something about when people like with the meaning crisis are talking about this kind of orbiting the beautiful, finding yourself taken by, all of that language is much more easier to understand when you situate it in the feminine experience. Mm-hmm. When you're situating in the male experience, you can kind of get it, you see what it's getting at, but you lack an easy analogy to understand. And the brain is analogous. That's the period. The brain is bound by analogy. We learn this in Surfaces and Essences by Hofstadter and Sander. I could go on Lakoff, on metaphor. The brain is an analogous, period. And when you start talking about freedom in with things like nesting or pregnancy, the analogous connection is way stronger.
Yeah.
And you can get what's being discussed.
Yeah.
But because we haven't had those resources, I think it's been harder to understand what people are getting at when they talk about being taken by the beautiful or orbiting or surrounded, the dialogos, the circling sort of experience. Well, all of these is the idea of getting in a conversation for one and just finding yourself flowing, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's become a certain reference point for what needs to be done to address the meaning crisis, as Viveki calls it, which is correct. But then the metaphor is bound to the conversational act. Mm-hmm. And so you can become limited in your capacity to think it. But once you bring it to the feminine experience, you start going, oh, okay, I can see it.
Yeah, and I think there's also something where, that's all really good, Daniel. This idea where you're compelled and you're doing the thing, and there's this I mean, again, I think about it in terms of relating it to the person who has given themselves fully over to the creative act, because at least in my experience, and I'll just speak on a personal level, like I see it in you, where when you have the focus and the flow on things, you also recognize what things matter and what things don't matter. Like there's some deep appreciation for whatever reason that or maybe just because I'm being more reflective about nesting, where I have had this deep appreciation for this flow that also makes me realize, like, my mental energy is not like I don't need to give it to anything else really except the nesting. I'm not saying like you don't talk to your neighbor stuff, right? I'm just what I'm saying is that like that would be part of the nesting, right? Like cultivating a space where people can drop by. What I mean to say though is there, and I don't know if I'm articulating it right, but I do think that flow state also does wonders in terms of your focus on what does matter and what doesn't matter. And it's weird because we're so fractalized, I think, today with our focus and our mental energy and what we allow to kind of take our mental energy. And it's in a nesting phase, I feel it really reminds you about
what matters
and also the fact that it also makes you feel almost like foolish for the times you have like allowed this leak of your focus and your mental bandwidth or whatever it is, because you're like, what was that even like fruitful? Like I mean maybe, but probably not. Like there's this real kind of discernment that I think comes as a secondary benefit to the flow state of just being a bit more discerning and mindful about your mind, like your mental
100%,
energy.
100%.
Does that
100%,
resonate?
yes, 1,000,000%. Because once you know this is a possible quality of experience, then it is possible in all experiences. And you ask yourself, why don't I make it more present in our experiences?
Like why don't I exactly? And I think I'm like, wow, I guess there's like you can see it in certain people where you're like, wow, it's almost like they're constantly allowing themselves to be fully impregnated and to be completely in a metaphorical sense, of course. But like, I mean, maybe literally if it's a woman and she's a mother and da-da-da. But it's like there's this their orientation to life is that. Like their whole orientation to life is that the rhythm of the gestation of the project or the person or the vision and these ebbs and flows of that, what that looks like of energy. Doesn't mean because again, there will be the time when you're in bed, know, to rest and nurse baby in the mother example, like, but that will also be its own natural type of flow. Yes. Where there's like like you're saying, the mental energy of constantly questioning yourself it's like a silenced, because you realize that these are the seasons and the ebbs and the flows that are natural in the flow.
But what you're getting at is if you're you can't, if you're stuck in deliberation, you never get to discernment. Yeah. Discernment is a product of making a decision. Yeah. This is the key. Like people conflate deliberation with discernment. They think I'm being discerning because I'm deliberating. Yeah. No, this is the interesting thing. Deliberation is necessary, but then once you choose something, that is your standard of discernment. Discernment has to have a standard, and so what ends up happening is if you never give yourself over to something, you're stuck in a life of deliberation that you will conflate with discernment.
Waiting to feel like you can be discerning or decisive.
Yes, that's correct. And so also, discernment, if we were to make a distinction between deliberation and discernment, which I think is extremely important.
Yeah, I do.
Deliberation is the choice A to B. Discernment is after you've chosen B, you discern if this aligns with B or not.
Exactly.
And most,
that's a great way to put it.
A very high percentage of people never leave deliberation. An incredibly high amount of people.
And that's the ping pong land, in my opinion. That's where the fragmentation, not fractalization.
No, it doesn't help that you have a culture of choice and individual autonomy and freedom and expression, because all of that is keep your options. We have a culture of keep your options and, keep your potential. So we are certainly in a culture of stay in a life of deliberation, because that's the best thing to do.
Safer.
Yeah, and you keep your options, and there's more choice and more possibility. Deliberation means more possibility. But once you're discerning, you're in B.
You've chosen.
A is off the table. There is no more A. There is no more C. So you're shrinking your horizon, right? But here's the funny thing. Actually, if you don't pick B, you don't have a horizon. This is the mistake. People think you have a horizon if you have A, B, and C. No. You never have a horizon until you make a decision.
Well, what if somebody's like, why need the horizon? Why not just A, B, C, D?
Because humans go crazy and you never have freedom. Yeah. You never have the fullness of the human experience.
Yeah, you never have the depth. I mean, because it's just the options, right? It's interesting to make that distinction, because you realize like there's this kind of unfolding or development of our experience and our relationship with decision making, discernment, etc. Because a lot of times the thought is like, well, I must be really discerning / decisive because I'm always in decision land. I'm always in option land. Yes. But actually, it's like I would say the opposite. But it's actually like that's the start of it though. Like that's not it. That's just the beginning. Yes. Once you make the choice, then you can discern. Yeah. Then you enter into discernment.
Yes, that's correct. And so the problem is, if you can't make that distinction, you are stuck in calculation. Yeah. You are stuck and here's the trick. Deliberation is the realm of anxiety, indecision, mental illness, confusion, emotional turmoil, because there's no ground. The sun is the earth is detached from the sun and floating off. Up is down, down is up. You know, in Nietzsche, right? So you have to make a decision, and this is the key. The decision is, what do you give yourself over to?
Yep.
If you never in your life decide to give yourself over to something, you can never enter deliberation. You can never enter into discernment, and therefore you can't be wise. Therefore, you can't grow up, therefore you can't mature. And therefore, you also can't do something noble or honor. All values become questionable. Because, how can you speak of the noble and the honorable if you are unable to give your life over to something, right? So all values get a certain weakening. That doesn't mean they have no meaning, but there's a certain, let's put it this way. Values like kindness or niceness or honor that stay in the realm of deliberation are confused, and they're more like complements. In the realm of discernment, they become deep, ontological, and fully human, because you really did take a risk. Like, to speak about kindness when there's no risk is different than speaking about kindness when there's risk. To speak about honesty when there's no risk is different than to speak about honesty when there is risk, in the deepest ontological sense. And that is what humans are made for. that is the address of the meaning crisis, is this kind of situation of, as we were saying at the net 135, absolute letting, where you then make the choice and you let yourself be that. You give yourself over to it. You let that thing run over you, and then you make this deliberation according to. And please note, when we're talking about attention and Simone Weil, awareness and Ivan Illich, and I think even a bit of the attention in McGilchrist, although it's a little different, those people are basically talking about they are talking about discernment. They are talking about this. You could associate awareness with nesting. Because, and it is tied to this idea of otherness. But think about what otherness is. Otherness is the idea that there's something that's not you that you are conforming your life to. In nesting, there's an experience of conforming your life to something that's not you and is you at the same time. That is the face in Levinas, in a way. That is the other. That is the background condition of possibility. And so also, there's many people who are noting that the only way to survive the attentionalist economy, as Bard calls it, is stuff like focus and awareness. Ladies and gentlemen, focus is nesting. Focus is the creative act. Attention, awareness in the Illich sense, means what you're describing. Nothing short of that will do. If you're talking about focus on your New Year's resolution, you can't, because it's in the realm of energy. You're gonna burn out. Focus has to become like nesting. It has to become something where you just do it without thinking about it. Because if you're thinking about focus, you will lose. You'll be scrolling on Instagram in 2 hours. But if you can enter into nesting, the creative act, the flow, which is only possible by making a choice, not staying in deliberation, but making a choice. None of this is possible unless you move from deliberation to discernment. If you do not do that, you will never, ever, ever, ever beat the algorithm. You will never beat the things taking your attention. You will be distracted, and you will be unable to reach the fullness of human awareness and attention that is so necessary for today, so that we can be fully human.
Yeah, no, that was very good, and I think you're quite right with the connection you made there with attention and awareness.
Because you're attending the nesting as well,
absolutely, too. Absolutely. I do feel as though with the, how do I put this? The ethics of the age, though, will certainly pose moments I'll say of, let's say this, in being reflective on what is nesting, or what is this phenomenon, and how does it relate to the meta dimensions of it, or like our human experience as creative beings, in trying to be skeptical or self-skeptical, I suppose.
Sure.
About it, just because I think that can prove helpful to think about it from a different angle, right? Because there's also people who feel like oh golly, like, no, that's not, you shouldn't determine yourself in such
Yes.
ways because you're limiting your freedom, blah, blah, blah. So again, to be
Of course.
self-skeptical can be good, to be more robust in your
Yes.
thinking about it, to also address those things where people may have, their own concerns, or like,
Of course.
because there is a part of it where I could maybe hear somebody saying like, well, that's literally just kind of reducing yourself to your, like, to almost your animalistic biology,
Sure.
and that's maybe less human, right? We're talking
Sure.
about being fully human in this
Sure.
process,
Sure. Of course.
but how this could be like less human. I mean, to that counterpoint, I think about it in terms of the facticity of, we have bodies, right? We have biology. So it's to me, I think let's think about the ways to work with it for the most optimal. I mean, not that it's just about optimization, but there is a way in which, like, fully human is an optimal state, is it not? Right? So it's like, how do we work with that biology for our embetterment? And I think to relate the actual biological processes of our bodies and their capacities and what they can do, to the realization of, like, oh wow, that actually teaches me something about what it means to be fully human as a creative being, is, to me, I think is wonderful and very valid. So yeah, speak to that, because I have one more counterpoint.
Well, I was just going to say, first off, that critique only works if you split the mind and body.
Yeah.
If we are bodies, well, then the body does this, therefore it is you doing it. It's not reducing you to your animalistic tendencies unless you're not your animalistic parts, right? So
right.
second,
that's so true.
So second, also, it just should be noted when we're talking about nesting, the idea is you have to give yourself over to something.
Absolutely.
Like, nesting is real, but it is also analogous of what will happen if you truly give yourself over to, say, farming. Give yourself over to family. Give yourself over to orphanage, writing. You must give yourself over to something.
Right.
And it must have a certain life over you. And nesting is just a tremendous example of when that occurs, and it is exactly the experience that is what happens in the creative act in its fullness, and people who live passion, meaningful lives. They just find themselves doing the thing.
Absolutely.
And you see, the reason why nesting is so important to focus on, and I'm very glad you brought it up, is because it's a description that describes the creative act that otherwise the creative just sounds crazy. And also, 100%. It sounds like the creative is just making excuses.
Yeah.
They're just saying, it's not really my choice. Okay, John, you just want to believe so you can get away with it, right? Yeah. Well, you have real experiences that women have. This is why the loss of the feminine has made it more difficult for us to get what the creatives or the passionates are talking about, because we're like, well, you are the only thing analogous to this example. Yes. I hear artists talking this way, and artists are the ones that are saying this way, but I have no reference point for that, right? It's like, well, what about nesting? Oh, okay, I can kind of get it now, right? Yeah. But since the feminine has been not the reference point for people to understand things, then what the creative and people are talking about with meaning is more difficult to understand. It sounds like excuse. That's the problem. Most people say, I want to have meaning in life, and a lot of people say, well, stop crybaby and pay your bills, right? And the problem is people also can't articulate what they mean by meaning, because they're using masculine resources, if you will, and that's not the resources you need to really get what flow and meaning are. It's things like birth. It is things like that. So this example is being used not to say everyone needs to have a baby, but you need to do something analogous to having a baby, and for many people it will easily look like having a baby, and that should not be discounted at frickin' all. And also it's saying that anything you think is meaningful that doesn't have this experience, this phenomenological experience, is not meaningful in the long run. It is temporarily meaningful. Keller had that distinction between discovered meaning and created meaning. A discovered meaning is robust. It feels like it's beyond you and bigger than yourself. A created meaning is fragile and ultimately feels arbitrary. Unless the word meaning for you is a word that is like nesting, your meaning will fail you. It is temporary. It is arbitrary. And you'll burn out. Let's put it that way. If your meaning is not a word that is like nesting, you will burn out. It will fail you. So I think that we've paid a high price to not have the metaphors and analogies of nesting and birth, and also things like, like Adriana will speak on with the period, and things like that. The period is another example of this. Like, so much of the feminine debate has been centered on having a child or not, motherhood or not, but the experiences that more get at the feminine experience are particular things like nesting, or having the period, or menopause. These things that feel like they're not just your choices. You find yourself having cycles. You find yourself doing things. Yeah. That, to me, as Adriana has brought out, and that you're bringing out, that is really so important when we talk about the feminine experience, because that is the meaning experience. That is the creative experience, where you find yourself in a cycle that you didn't ask for, but the question is, what now?
Yes.
And not really focusing on that dimension of the feminine experience, I think, has strongly impoverished our capacity to understand things like the quote-unquote absolute letting, flow, meaning, etc., so forth.
Right. Right, and the creative process itself.
Yes.
Which is so vital to us being human or feeling human.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. No, that was all very good, and that addressed that quite well. Two things came to mind. One was my other counterpoint that sometimes happens when I'm being self-skeptical about,
of course,
the benefits, or like the positive things I see in nesting, or I'm learning from nesting. So the one is just, to the point when you're talking about excuses and stuff like that, I do think that not tying things to our biology or these determinations of giving yourself over fully to something, that, like I said, you're free to give all your freedom away so that you can get into the freedom flow.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I think that is, it's quite detrimental, and it does do this separation between mind and body.
100%.
That, and then people just see creative act as like, you just like expressing yourself, which I'm not saying it's inherently wrong to like it. Of course, there's a beauty and an importance to expressing oneself, but we kind of think of it as just merely, we only think about it in terms of like want.
The ego, yes.
And the ego. And in a sense, yeah, of course you wanted to put yourself in a position where you could be taken over completely. Yeah. But you also have, it's
do you want to nest? Does that word capture the experience?
It's like, it's not, it's weird, because it's not, you don't think about it in terms, you're just not thinking about it at all. Like, you're not thinking about it in terms of even wanting to do it.
No, that's why the word want doesn't capture it at all.
I guess experientially, like, somebody would look at you and say, oh, she must want to clean that or something.
But the one in the experience knows better. They know the word want is too weak to describe what's going on.
No, maybe in saying this, it's like, well, that kind of reveals how we have this sort of strange relationship with want, where it's like, oh, it's wrong to want. But I think we do have I think in general we have this strange relationship.
We don't know what want is for. Yeah, we are confused by what want is for.
I think so. I think it is very confusing, and that's why, I did that little recording on like fear as a litmus test versus like wants and needs language, because I think it just gets very confusing for people. And I do think it's important to bring up the concept of want, though, in relationship to this topic, though, because a lot of our freedom, or giving away all our freedom, will have a lot to do with what are the things we want ultimately. You know what I'm saying?
Well, in my opinion, the point of want is to make a deliberation, and then once you've made the deliberation, want goes to the side, because now you're just discerning what aligns or not. And here's the truth: want exists because humans need to want something to take them over.
Yes.
But you see, notice that. Mm-hmm. You want something to take you over, okay? Mm-hmm. That means your want, in a way, dies.
Yeah. And now you don't think in terms of want.
Want is on the side of deliberation. Want is not on the side of discernment. Mm-hmm. On the side of discernment is letting. Mm-hmm. You want something and then let.
You progress. It's like a maturity of that want into letting.
Letting is the negation, sublation of want. So the problem is a society stuck in deliberation can only think of everything as want, and that cannot compute or make sense of letting and deliberation and discernment.
And I do think it's important to bring it up here, because another reason why is that the want topic does have real consequences on people's mental energy.
Huge.
Because they think, oh, well, If
I just want it. Yeah.
If I'm writing a poetry collection, maybe I just want to. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe I'm.
Yes.
Da, da, da,
And you're in deliberation.
Yeah.
That's
Instead
right.
of it being like, wait a second, what is, like you're saying, the want is a deliberation that then you actually make a choice, and then it's no longer about wanting, it's about the letting.
That's correct.
And it's not even a factor anymore,
No, it's gone. It's sublated.
Whether it's easy or
sublated.
hard now, it's kind of like.
It's sublated.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think really quick, one last thing on this. I think too, you can see how it does progress from the wanting to the letting, because the concept, the question of want is so almost like ridiculous.
Yes.
Like, for example, do you want to go through labor?
Yeah. It's an impoverished word.
It's an impoverished concept for that, because just thinking like labor can be quite difficult.
Yes.
Okay. So it's like you said, it's an impoverished word for it, because yes, you want in the sense you're going to let that occur. Of course you are.
The word simply doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't.
It's
I don't
ridiculous
think it works.
to try, and we're in a culture that has to think of everything. Here's the problem: you're in a culture that is stuck in deliberation, so it has to think of everything as want. And keep in mind, want is deliberation. What else is want but deliberation?
Yeah.
And so you're in a culture stuck in deliberation and want. And so the higher dimensional experiences of human beings. Because another way to think about this is basically deliberation is algebra. A, B. What do you want? 2 plus 2 equals what? Deliberation. Discernment is once you say the answer is 4, now I'm going to discern everything as 4 or not. You see? But deliberation is want, and so if all we have is a society that can only think in terms of deliberation and want, then higher geometrics or higher dimensional experiences of human beings cannot be computed, because the tool can't compute it. And humans are made for higher dimensionality, per se.
Yeah.
And so literally we're in a culture that can't compute the dimensionality it seeks.
Yeah. No, that was very well said. Yeah, and I think, sure, if you have to, because a lot of times when the mindset is stuck in once, in a sense you're gonna, my answer would be like, yes, I want to go through labor because I want to meet the baby. I want to allow the natural process of what occurs.
But you're trying to, it's like a circle fitting themselves into a square.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I want to, but that doesn't quite capture. You're squishing a higher dimensional phenomenon into a flatter answer to satisfy the other who can't think higher dimension.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and this is kind of like a little rabbit hole. Let's not go down it too far. But I will make mention that I think technology complexifies
1,000,000%.
this arena of deliberation that we can tend to find ourselves stuck in this age.
Technology serves deliberation.
Because again, for example, like you could just get an epidural, and you wouldn't be feeling all of that, those sensations, or not to the same degree.
Yes.
And it's like, so you must want to feel all of, and it's so it's still stuck in that one. It's like, well, but the want doesn't work for this, because it's like, yes, you allow it, you let it. So in a sense, yes, I guess you want it, but you also
But this is
you also you let it. That you just let it happen, because you have accepted what that entails.
Yes.
And you want to meet the baby.
Yes.
And
you're letting yourself become the being who feels that pain.
Yeah.
And also very important, but what you're getting at right here is in a sense the perniciousness of the technological essence of Heidegger, because technology turns everything into into deliberation, and therefore there's no room for discernment.
Yeah, and it's interesting because just when you kind of feel like, okay, you can maybe be moving from the want to the letting, technology sucks it back into the, kind of reverts
it's
it
always
back into
shrinking the territory of deliberation in its favor. And the human only matures in the space of discernment.
Yeah.
And so if technology has removed the spaces of discernment and letting, then humans cannot mature. Humans cannot be their full self, and they can't be happy. Because we're only happy in our maturity. And I'll say very quickly, want and deliberation are on the side of the youth. It is what you do and figure out in the first, say, 25 years of your life.
Sure.
But the next 70 years of your life are very much supposed to be in the realm of discernment and letting.
Yeah.
You should not be in the realm of deliberation and want at 40. But we are in a culture that all of the incentives and all of the ethics are on the side of keeping everyone in a permanent state of deliberation and wants. So this is when they talk about the coddling of the American mind, for example, this idea that people are not growing up. Unfortunately, they overly index that as narcissism, pleasure-seeking, henotheism. I think that's a very improper, that's not the right way to look at it, because it confuses the issue.
Yeah.
No, you don't grow up when you stay in deliberation and want. And that, you could be the most selfless person on planet Earth. But if your mental processes are all deliberation and understands reality in terms of want, you actually have not matured.
Yeah.
Because you haven't intellectually matured. You could be the nicest, most selfless, most unegotistical. You may not go to the mall ever, but you could actually still not be matured because you're still thinking of reality in terms of deliberation and want.
Yeah. Well, and just to add, that isn't to say that the use of such technologies that then potentially draw people back into deliberation land are necessarily going to mean your maturation or not, depending on how you are oriented toward those technologies.
If technology is moved into discernment, it's good.
Right, and so that, again, for one person that could mean them getting an epidural, and for the other person it doesn't.
Sure.
That means they don't. It's actually, I think, more about the orientation toward that in general. That,
yes.
That the majority will have.
Yes.
What I mean to say is, again, very, very much your own personal discernment in line with your B. Like,
yes.
You said about choosing B, right? In
yes.
line with your B, right? So, again, for that one person that might mean getting an
yes.
epidural, for the other person that means not getting an
yes.
epidural. The point of the matter is, though, how we see that choice of others making. That's, I think, the arena where it gets
difficult,
and also not it. It's almost like people are quite susceptible, as we are as humans, to feel very confident in making assessments about other people's choices.
Yes.
And deliberations, because they're stuck in the deliberation want framework.
Yes.
And instead of it being like, no, it's about you discerning it for yourself and keeping it there. Literally just keeping it there. Don't even think about what other people are doing or what they're choosing, or making some making some macro claim, that's the word I'm looking for, about what other people are doing.
But if you can't move to discernment, that the way you contain it is to move to discernment. If it's just once, then why did you want X instead of B? Right? Yeah. But if there's something you've chosen that you're discerning that only you can know, oh, well, that's why. See, if you don't move to discernment, then everyone can judge everyone else's wants. It's just a want fest.
Exactly, and I think that leads to further fragmentation, because this is real.
The irony is discernment actually leads to harmony,
yes.
which would sound like it would fragment because everyone has their own individual discernment, but actually that gives you a solid ground by which to relate to the other. But if you're in a world of wants, that sounds freer and like you could interact, but actually you don't, because you don't have a solid ground by which to interact with difference.
Oh, 100%. So, and then you get people feeling judged in families or hurt, or stuff gets brought up at the table, or when are you going to do this, or when and all that, or why'd you do that? And it's like a mess. It's a complete mess. And these things have real consequences. That leads to a lot of drama for families or people in general. And it's like
a society of deliberation will be traumatized.
Yeah.
And repressed.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. So the other counterpoint, though, that I wanted to bring up, I said about the person saying, oh, well, like, now we're just animalistic. The other one is that, but you should be fragmented. You should be, thinking that every single ping or avenue of communication should be attended to. And you're just it's convenient that you can sort of shave off what you should be really focusing on because of your nesting flow.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, this is me being reflective and having moments of feeling like, am I just using that as a justification to not attend to the multifaceted things you could potentially attend to as a human modern being today, right, in this day and age?
Sure.
But then I think to myself, okay, but you will have to ultimately make discernment about how you spend your energy, and how you spend your mental energy and capacity. And as long as it's still in line with your B, right, the thing, like we said, the thing you chose and you choose, then that's a time to step further into a confidence in that that sense of discernment and focus. Not not to question it just because we've gotten so used to just being a fragmented mind in this day and age. So, anyways, I just wanted to bring that up.
If you don't choose your B, you're going to be eaten by burnout. Because the secret is there's this weird thing where actually discernment is how you maintain, quote unquote, time energy. That actually what ends up happening is like, well, don't you want to be a multifaceted being? Well, one, you won't.
Don't you
because
care? Like the modern ethic is like, oh, don't you care if you're not, if you're not using on Messenger and this and that and this, all the 15 million like communication avenues you could potentially be on. And
people use care to doom one another to exhaustion, and then they wonder why everyone is exhausted all the time.
Exactly.
Like care is being used as a weapon to burn everyone out.
Yeah.
And you see, you will burn yourself. You calculate in the realm of want, deliberation, and calculation, algebra. Burnout is inevitable, and just being destroyed. You're gonna lose something. You're gonna have to give up your mind. You're gonna have to give up your body. Something will have to be sacrificed to maintain that system. Because it is entropic. Wherever there's calculation, there's entropy. The only way to get negentropy is with a stable system that you can accelerate entropy toward that ironically creates complexity. Now, that was a mouthful, but the weird thing is that actually subtraction is how you create complexity. And that has to be elaborated on. Jim Rutt talks about that a lot. He had a talk with Ebert where they got into that a little bit, which was really nice. But the idea is that people go, well, don't you want to be multifaceted? You won't be, because you'll be burned out. And also, if you do everything, you'll find it meaningless. Look at all these people who do everything. Without a discernment, it dies to them, or they're destroyed by it, because there's too much they experience without the character to handle it, and it destroys them. So in a way, it's a false choice. It's actually a false choice. If you don't close any doors on your world, then the world destroys you. And you actually don't even have a world. So it's a false choice.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a very good point. And I think there's also a way in which in experiencing the flow of nesting, I know we already said this, but there's almost a way in which you're like, wow, this is the way this is the mode of life. And there's this it's almost like makes me think of Nietzsche a bit.
Yes, because nesting should be noted. Like you were talking about ethics, that the care, don't you care? That's Nietzsche is all over this, because he would say that ethics is used all the time to keep people from quote unquote nesting.
Absolutely,
because nesting is akin to the child with value. Because what is it? It's the noble versus the vile. That's not it, but it's the noble versus the contemptible. Yeah. The noble chooses that this is good to do, versus when you're stuck in good and evil, you're just doing what everyone else says is good and evil, and you're controlled, right? But the child can say this is valuable, and they'll choose it for themselves, right? Exactly. So like basically everything that's being described is nesting is the mode of the child. Not just the camel or the lion, but the child. And what you see in nesting is the child, but it requires the ability to not get thrown off by the ethics of the day, and to say this is valuable, and I will discern things in light of this. This I've chosen. So Nietzsche's good, to give it back to you.
Yeah, and the concept of like almost the sacred no.
100%.
Sacred no. And realizing like, wow, there's that is also tied to this freedom flow, which you have determined yourself to, or something like that, because you realize that, it actually is accessible to me.
Yes.
I just have to give myself over.
You have to make an absolute choice.
Something. Yeah.
You absolutely choose, and then you have absolute letting. Yeah. That's you have to make a choice, and then you can discern everything in light of that.
Yeah.
And that is, when the B, that would be, that's getting into stuff like theme with Mr. Luber. This is the theme. Yeah. Now, in the letting, your theme is then the letting, which is, I think, like we were talking the other day, the sublation, but that would have to be elaborated on. But no, nesting is also a good word, because the creative, you create something for people to rest in. You're creating a nest. You're creating a place for people to be born anew in the creative work, or when you do a monastery, or when you give yourself, like
every human that fully gives themselves over to something is in essence creating a nest. You know, they are creating a place where people can live and learn to fly. You know, so nesting is a tremendous word for it.
Yeah. Well, I do think there's something quite beautiful about it, and a great illustration, truly.
Yeah.
And I do think really quick about, I think about nesting and birds, and I think about some of the bird imagery throughout, like, Under the Wing.
Sure.
And in a sense, there's something, I know this is also my kind of counter to the counter of the animalistic point, because we, as humans, though, we aren't merely animals, right? We're humans, but we also do have bodies and biologies, and we are, in some ways, an ecosystem with the animals themselves.
Yes.
And I guess there's something, though, that I have found that is quite grounding and comforting about watching the birds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look to the birds of the air. We also have the class of parallax, where the way they nest, the way that they do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that's just so, the fact that they're consistently doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I just had this one day where I was looking at the birds, and it just brought such comfort somehow that, like, throughout any and all the seasons, they do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They do this flow. In a way, I wonder if that is something that is the gifting of animals in some ways.
They discern. The what's very interesting about animals is they
like
almost automatically discern, where humans have deliberation.
Yes.
Which
makes us, in some ways, doesn't make us human.
Yes, but it comes with a risk. There's a weird way in which the knowledge of good and evil is deliberation. Because you had to deliberate between good and evil versus just discern it. Adam could discern essence. And then he gave it up for deliberation.
Yeah.
Which then, of course, critically, as Ross notes and many people have noted, Eden is not called perfect. It is called good. New Jerusalem is perfect. So there's a sublation of deliberation and discernment that creates a higher discernment. But animals are discernment. And in a way, when people, like, it is, in a way, you need to give to your animalistic nature, because you need to actually be discerning. You need to, like, and it's a humbling act, though.
Yes.
And this is what's very interesting. Like, humans find their fullness in becoming animal, which is kind of funny because that's what Deleuze talks about. But it's becoming animal not in the terms of wild expression, but becoming animals. Animals are very focused on survival.
Yes.
And in a way, humans need discernment to be very focused on fullness. Which entails survival, but is also different. It has that spiritual dimension to it, that meaning dimension to it, right? But no, there's a very real sense in what humans need is to become more animal-like. But what we mean by that is not pleasure-seeking, but focused.
Yes.
And willing to be repetitive. Animals are willing; they will the repetition.
Yes.
And that's what they identify with their determination, and they find freedom in it.
Yep, 100%.
I mean, before I forget, I mean, to me, I think this is very important, too, is that the opposite for me of nesting is hoarding. And this is very important because, I love the topic of hoarding because I think it's the perfect example of autonomous rationality, where you can't make a decision on what to throw. You can't discern what to keep or not, so you keep everything.
That's autonomous rationality.
Yes, and it's like the logic, when people are talking about game A, right? Game A is get all the toys, win. Who can get the most? Who gets the most money? The logic of our society is hoarding, and basically, what human fullness is found in nesting. Okay, hoarding. We talk about hoarding all the time. Like, hoarding is people go, oh, why are these people on the Discovery Channel, like, their houses are just full of stuff? How do they do it? Look at yourself. How much do you struggle to throw something away that you may one day need? Hoarding is a revelation. Hoarding is rational because you may need these things. And basically, to not be a hoarder, you just have to decide, I'm going to throw it away. But it's a complete non-rational choice. Hoarding is a revelation of how rationality works. And basically, the economy and everything is a revelation of hoarding. And what we see is that humans are not happy when they hoard. They're not happy at all. And basically, game A, if the planet is being eaten up and we're taking all the resources, what is that but a kind of hoarding logic? We can't stop. Nick Land, all of that, the logic of capital, AI is a kind of hoarding. AI is going to get all the data. It'll hoard everything. Everything will be hoarded. Because also when you talk about leave your options, or you're saying hoard your options.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
I mean,
the
keep it all.
deliberation phase and all the options is a type of hoarding, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because you don't want to give up any of the options. You want to make sure you have everything. Because when you hoard, what are you doing? Keeping my options open.
Yeah.
If I get rid of this, I won't have the option of using it.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't throw anything away to make sure you have the option of using it in the future. That is what we have now moralized as basically how you live a fulfilling life, is to hoard. And then, of course, your brain doesn't function because it's hoarding everything. You don't function because you're hoarding everything. And then one day you're like, how did I get here? Because that's the tragedy of hoarders. They feel it's so sad because they know they've got a problem, but they don't know how to get out of it. That's what happens to human beings.
Yeah.
And that's what happens without nesting.
When I do think that's why, in a way, it does make me think of like a case for the determination of biology, for example,
Completely.
or something, because, or this giving yourself over to something doesn't have to necessarily be, like you said, a biological gestation and birth. It can be, and like you said, that shouldn't be discounted because it's very important. Because the thing, I guess what I mean to say is that it like literally programs into your rhythm, or into the rhythm of your life, the seasons of your life, that you will actually do the nesting, and you will remove, you will go through, you will decide, make decision.
You'll make this, that's right.
On things, so that you can make the nest.
Yes.
Because a nest is a structure, but it also has the space.
Yes.
For the eggs.
Yes.
Right. For the ability to sit on the eggs, for them to hatch, for them to come to return to bring the food to. Like it's about this both creating the space and also making space and creating the space.
Yes.
Like we were talking about too, where like that wild concept where like a wall is most functional as a wall when you make a door in it, right?
When
Which
it's
is
a little
make it
less wall.
like a wall, right,
Yes.
right. So that's the concept here with nesting too.
Well,
and
nesting,
it's like if you just were compelled by your own biology to have these seasons, it seems so limiting, and yet it's like, whoa, actually that limitation frees me to being able to do the thing I need to do but cannot. It's hard to get yourself to do it, because I can feel the difference. It's a wild thing where it's like me trying to go through things when I'm not in a biological nesting phase is much harder. I do a lot more deliberating.
Yes.
I wore this once, or I might use this again, or da-da-da-da. And with nesting, there's this strange precision of, I'm not saying it's like perfection or something, but there is a totally different experience of it, where you feel much more, decisive. Right, like you feel much more of a precision of sorting, like keeping this, getting rid of that, put this here, da-da-da, and so you almost like force yourself to do the thing, like that determination forces you to do something. Like we're saying, it takes over, and then you're doing it, something that you would not, like rationally would never, like kind of need you to do, because rationally you might use that thing, right?
That's the determination saves you from hoarding.
Yeah, and I think I love that comparison of those two concepts of like the hoarding and the nesting, because there's also something that recognizes the transience in nesting that hoarding does not allow. Like the whole point, which is weird, because often the nesting looks like, oh, it's such a traditional life, and you're so like there's a stability. Oh, you're like what do people say, settling down, or like making your roots, da-da-da. But actually, like that is where you experience and have to allow yourself the risk of the transient, of the seasons, of the phases, of the fact that your children will always be the ages they're at. They won't say the cute things that they're saying right now. They'll say something else, and that will be also cute and wonderful too.
Right.
But these things are transient, and it's there's a real sense of grief in that, but there's also a joy of the participation in the work. And nests are not, a bird's nest is a fleeting thing. Like it's there for a season, and a time, and then it fades. The birdies grow up and they go, and then that is pulled apart or falls apart, and then they make it again. Like this repetition. And so what's interesting though is that the transient has been conflated for the rootlessness, right? And the ability to sort of move between the options and have the options always kind of open, and yet that isn't actually allowing the depth of what it really means to allow for the transient nature of life.
I think that's excellent. There's an interesting thing where nesting is temporal, hoarding is spatial. You want to keep it in your space and have it. There's something interesting where if you don't, the only way to have temporal development is by roots. Roots then create a space where there can be temporal change.
Yes.
I mean, there's another way.
Like a perennial plant or something, right? The roots are always there.
Yeah.
But the plant's going to have its different phases.
Yeah, and if humans are time-space more than space-time, we find meaning in temporal change more than spatial change.
Yes.
Now, I guess you could say the following. What ends up happening if you're just never put down roots, there's not really a meaningful difference between spatial and temporal time. Diff change. Because, you're changing spaces, which is marked by changing time, but you don't experience the change of time uniquely. When you're living in the same home, in the same space, the change of time is very pronounced. Yeah. When you're also changing space and time, the change of time is not so pronounced, right? So there's something about when you make a choice, then you move into, time. This is why you can move mostly to discernment, because time is doing the work of putting things in front of you that then you discern be or not be. Not be no. So then time, rather than your own individual choice through space, is what is bringing things to you to discern. But so you don't have to deliberate, because time's just going to bring things, right? And so this is also quite critical, because when we talk about, like the other day at the net with absolute letting, how does that work? That if you just absolutely choose the letting, well, then you're just going to die between the piles. No, time will develop that will move a pile closer to you or turn your head, per se. But likewise, what ends up happening is time presents things to you that then you discern according to, right? Yes. So what ends up happening in a life of deliberation and want, you're stuck in space, per se. You're stuck in space-time, we'll say. But when you move to discernment, where you've chosen a place in space-time, well, then you move to discernment, and now you're in time-space, per se. And time is the main variable.
Absolutely.
And here's the trick. Humans are more time than space. Yeah. And so if you never move to a place where time is the dominant role, you never grow up. Yeah. You never go into your fullness.
And I think what's important with what you're saying is that it also reveals that this isn't to make some you're actually still stuck in space-time. If you're thinking about it merely in terms of the physicality of does the person have some rooted home or not, right?
Yes.
You can actually be a very rooted person in your creative project,
yes.
in the passion that you have, or the thing you've given yourself fully to. You actually may live in 10 countries a year or something with that particular calling or passion. So that it's not about literally being necessarily in one place in and having your roots in one place. I think that can be a form of it, and I think it's one that affords its own sort of shedding of light on this particular topic. But I think about, go back to the birds. Birds migrate. Birds also do funny things like molt all their feathers, and they have a different set of feathers for a different season.
Yes.
Things like this. What I mean to say is that it's not just to say that sometimes we get stuck in the binary thinking like, oh, now we're just saying that you'll only mature if you settle down, right? That's not that's too superficial. I feel like that's too reductionistic or superficial on what we're saying. What we're saying is about the deep-rootedness.
The choice. You have to make an absolute choice.
Right. And nobody can know that. Yeah, from the outside, it can look like you just did the script, right? You just, you went to college, you got married, you did your thing.
Only you can discern.
Only you can, but only you can know, and only you can know.
Because only you have the choice.
Right.
Only you have the standard of the discernment.
Right. And it's a lot more about your own relationship to that choice, and how that then always kind of is your litmus test for your discernment than it is about how other people. Obviously, it's going to be more about that than how other people see it. But it's also less about what that looks like in space, right?
Correct.
Throughout space,
Correct.
Or in the spatial arrangement of what that means.
Well, one of the reasons there's incentive to stay in deliberation is because the other's judgment is you're safer from it. Because you can change.
So, right.
And so if the others
I'm not that way, or it's not like that. Or
if you stay in deliberation, you protect yourself from the judgment of the neighbor.
Yes.
Or what if I make a mistake and the others think I make a mistake? You can always move. right? So one of the key reasons why people stay in deliberation is because of the pressure of the other, of the judgment of the neighbor. They want to be able to switch over if people don't understand, right? And so that's a main problem.
And also you could spatially look like you've settled down.
Yes.
And yet, if you haven't actually done the work to do this sort of maturation into discernment, you will not be settled.
Correct.
You will not be settled at all. And in fact, there can be a lot of unfortunate consequences from that can arise, because a settling isn't merely the spatial thing.
Yes.
It's about the giving yourself over to it fully. It's about the mental giving that is going to cause and allow for the rootedness and that settling that to occur, right?
Yes.
The settling that also is disrupted, like I said, by the natural time, like you're talking about this time that then is going to bring the transience and is going to bring the scrambling up of, like, what I mean to say by scrambling up is that there's never just a stagnant state, some settled state, it's like, it's constantly, there's so much change and flux, but it's all because you are doing something, though, that is your givenness over to the thing.
Yes. Once you give yourself over to something, time plays the main role.
Yeah.
And time is vibrant. It is vital, as Bergson says.
Yeah.
Time is creative. And so if you never give yourself over to time as the prime thing, you never enter full creativity or birth or maturation, any of these different things.
Yeah, and not to, bring up like an unfortunate situation, but when I'm saying about the settled on how there's a difference between what just somebody looking, it's like that's why people can also settle down, but then they can get a divorce, or they're having radical challenges with their own life or situation or whatever it is. It's like it doesn't. So it's not enough. It's not enough. It can possibly be the incubation space for that. But it's not merely time. It's time, space. So it's it will relate to your space and how you allow for.
Well, you can't settle if you settle, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And please note, it's interesting. Like, settling down has a negative connotation, but the opposite of settling is unsettled. You're unsettled.
It's funny to think about all the words there, because it's like settling down, but then there's unsettled. And then there's also the new term that often comes up in dating, like, don't settle.
Yeah.
Right? Don't settle for that type of man, or blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
It's really interesting. That could be a whole other topic,
but if you settle, I'll just say that, but you don't move from deliberation to discernment, you're in huge trouble. Yeah. Settling is a space of discernment. And if you're still deliberating in settling, you've got a mismatch.
Absolutely.
That's going to lead to real trouble. Because settling is what you do when you're going to let time take over, which you can only do once you've made a choice to then discern what time presents you with.
Yes.
So if you settle without a choice, an absolute choice, you're in trouble. And that's what's happening. And that's what people are doing, because they're following a social script, not a maturing soul. Yeah, and so they move to a place before they've moved to a place. And so then they're in trouble. Yeah. They're in huge trouble.
Yeah, and you can also be rather settled in a way of life that could be looking like you don't have any roots.
Yes,
and so
that's the issue.
The thing is, it just, you have to kind of get into the nuance of the fact that it can't just be reduced to some sort of spatial arrangement.
It's flat versus dynamic in a way. Is it flat? Does it have this? Is it monotone? A lot of times when people talk about you've settled, they mean your life is monotone now. It has the same tone.
Down now,
it has a monotone, right? Mm-hmm. But you can be traveling everywhere and it's monotone.
Yeah,
because it's just the same old, right? So basically you're saying your life will now be the same old, right? Every life that does not transition to discernment will be the same old. It will just be another deliberation, another deliberation, another deliberation.
Because the irony is that a lot of people fear the monotone in a choice.
Yes.
Right? In a
because that's the ethos, that's the ethnic, that's what technology trains you into. Mm-hmm. And it even suggests that in its very essence, and its very way of presenting reality, right?
Yeah.
And so but again, technology, before I forget, because you were making the very good point on once you're nesting, you go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Like nesting also too, it's interesting with nesting and hoarding, because nesting, you're gathering things to make a nest, so there's a kind of gathering in nesting, but the gathering is in the context of removing what can't be gathered.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's something hoarding like in nesting, in that you're bringing together. But the issue is in the hoarding, you can't tell the difference between what you need for a nest and what you need to remove for the space of the nest.
Yes, 100%.
That's what occurs, right? But that's what ends up happening when all you can do is deliberate and you can never discern.
Yeah.
You're stuck in hoarding wins. That's why this is like when you're in a world of technology and capital, you're always going to get more technology. You're always going to get more capital. You're always going to get more growth. Always, because in hoarding you can't tell the difference, so it's just probability will go on the side of more. Like that's why hoarding grows. Like there will never be a day where hoarding decides it's hoarded enough, because that in of itself would go against the ethic that brought it about. So you're always going to accumulate. Absolutely. And accumulate, right? So you're going to always accumulate more possibility, and you'll never move to discernment, and that possibility will be the victory of technology over the human, the victory of the system over the human, because what makes us human versus a robot is our capacity to discern, which is a temporal act. Computers make decisions. Computers will, they make a decision, but the decision they don't make further discernments based on. They give you an answer and move to the next, move to the next, move to the next. They're just an ever deliberation machine. They complete a deliberation, then to another deliberation, and it's an ad infinitum of deliberations that never transition into discernment. Humans can transition into discernment because we can be temporal, because we can discern the form of our absolute choice against and with whatever time presents us with in our life, what we've chosen, right? But that's where computers can't. Computers and all of that can only calculate another what's going to grow, what's not, and so on and so forth, right? So the problem is, if humans can't tell this difference, we also can't make ourselves distinct from the system or the AI or the economy or whatever. And so then, of course, we give ourselves over to that and we let it do our thinking for us, because why shouldn't it?
Right. No. That was great. Those are some great points. And it made me think too about something that is a realization of, well, what is ultimately like autonomous rationality. Like we'll talk about that then justifies hoarding, justifies the system, which then can just do our thinking for us, right? Because it does deliberation very well. Like so great. Like just let it do our deliberating for us. Not realizing that we have to actually step further into the further stage. The more, the stage of discernment. But I was thinking about how I had this moment when, because there are moments where I'm like, oh, I'm throwing away this adorable shirt that, our youngest wore. And I remember this cute moment that he, for his birthday, where he was wearing the shirt with his birthday cake, but I'm like, but it's got stains on it now, and I think it had a hole in it too, and I was like, it's probably time to throw this away. It's also too small for him, probably. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, it's probably time to throw this away. Even though it's a very sweet shirt, and I had this moment where I realized. Because I was thinking about my friend who she's, I don't know, I'm not sure. Her mode is just a bit more like you clear out your closet. Like she does it more regularly, and she's seems from my outside and when I'm not in my like this sort of determined free nesting flow, I can be like, how did she do that? Yeah. Now in the nesting flow, I'm like, whoa, I guess that maybe this is what maybe I wonder if she feels like this all the time or something like that. Yeah. But the point of the matter is, I had this realization that I'm being materialistic. Because the thing is that sometimes there's this thought of like, because I had this, I was like, but she likes nice things. And that there's, in a way of like having things that are like good quality and da-da-da. So I'm like, but then why does she give away the things too? And then I was like, wait a second, I feel like I'm being more materialistic, actually, in having, like, hoarder tendencies that we all do as humans, but I'll admit, sometimes I can have them, what seems to be stronger than others. And I was like, because I'm thinking to myself, oh, I should keep this, because I could use this again. Yes. And tying it to all of these, like, emotional moments, and as if this shirt is my child. Yes. And it's not my child. This shirt is something my child wore. Yes. And so it's like, in some ways I'm being more materialistic than my friend who actually does have an appreciation for fine goods and nice things, but it will also be very willing to part with those things.
Yes.
When she realizes it's not functional anymore.
Yes.
Like this is literally torn, or this is
Yeah.
taking up too much space, blah blah blah. So I'm like, oh, it was just this very good convicting moment of like, I guess in a way, the hoarders are often people who are very frugal.
Yes.
Right? They're extremely frugal. They want to
Yes.
save things. They
Yes.
want to
Yes.
reuse stuff. And
Yeah.
I'm not trying to judge
That's a
that.
good
Again,
connection.
like
Yeah.
I can resonate with that. But it's like, oh, actually that's very materialistic.
Yes.
And so it was a moment of like, let go. Let it go.
Yeah.
Like it's your children, your people, the memories, the actual human beings are what matters. Not just the stuff that we encase ourselves with or have used or whatever.
Well, I think
So
that's a fantastic point, because I think we associate materialism with greed
Yes.
and ego and stuff, but materialism is the inability to part with material.
Exactly. And it's like materialism also may be linked to this autonomous rationality.
100%. Autonomous
More than it is
rationality.
about if you like to buy a linen sheet set or something you like that. You know what I'm saying? Like it's
Completely. Rationality leads to materialism in this sense, because because rationality that cannot make itself distinct from truth,
yes.
where truth is the discernment and your absolute choice, rationality then will simply organize itself relative to what is presented to it, which is always material. And so rationality will serve materiality when it's autonomous, right? And create more materiality and multiply it and keep it and never let it go away, because it's God. The God of an autonomous rationality is the material world. But the problem with it, in one way that's good, because you say, well, great, we want it to be the world. But the problem is, what is the difference between embodiment and the goods of the environment and preserving the world and materialism? What is the difference? Because if you think about it, actually, they're not that different.
Yeah.
Like, why is
Like
the environment
material
not materialism?
Yeah.
It's made of material,
Yeah.
right? It's a relation to the material, right? And basically, materialism is hoarding.
Yeah.
That is materialism, is hoarding. But what makes hoarding? And you've pointed out something extremely important. People who hoard are often frugal. They are not people you'd look at and think are greedy.
Never.
They cannot let the material go. Materialism is the inability to let things go, but autonomous rationality would have you never let anything go. It is always dumb to throw stuff away.
Yeah.
Until it is making you sick. Until it is but that means autonomous this is what we write about all the time. Autonomous rationality only recognizes itself at what? Crisis.
Yeah.
And
I literally
World
can't
War.
move through my house
Yeah,
anymore.
at
Like, I
crisis it will do. But now we're in an age where if we get to crisis, the game's over, or the consequences are too dire, right? And so, but for most of history, autonomous rationality has corrected itself by crisis. Hoarding will correct itself at crisis, but then at that point it might be World War III. And so materialism is not, I think the point you've made is extremely important. Materialism is the inability to let material go. Because also, you can think of it like this. Materialism is space over time. Because when you're able to let things go, you also believe or have a faith, one could say, in time to present to you what is needed when you need it, and you'll have the wit and the discernment to figure out how to get the things when you need it to solve your problems. Because basically material hoarding is when you're like, what if a problem arises,
Yes.
I won't be able to solve because I don't have this.
Yes, exactly.
Materialism is when you give up on your own problem-solving capacity.
Well, yeah, and then to tie to Illich, and what
Yes.
you do a great job with elucidating in Illich too, is like we haven't necessarily prepared ourselves.
No.
Like we, and I think nesting is quite a preparatory. We've already linked it to. Being
If you're
preparation.
stuck in deliberation, hoarding makes sense.
Well, yeah, we also, if we don't cultivate preparation and skills,
Correct.
right? Then no wonder
We're
we're stuck in
materialist.
hoarding. No wonder.
Yeah.
Like,
Because
no
it's our
wonder.
only. Because if we don't have what we need, we're dead or we're in trouble. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that that's all really good, and I think too, again there's this moment where you're like, well, I keep it because I'm I don't worry if my like if we wear a secondhand shirt or
you moralize
like
it.
you kind of moralize it as like you're being like the
saint,
humble
yeah.
saintly person.
Yes.
And then I was like, oh my gosh, like my friend is actually more like that in
Yeah.
her ability to let go.
Yeah.
And to recognize that it's not about this stuff, it's about the person
That's
themselves. And yet somehow we yeah, it was just so eye-opening, because then you think to yourself, oh wow, like actually if I really mean it about it being about the people, then I don't need to cling on to something that is, has become some simple, I don't know, maybe there's something that's kind of like the Egyptians, like where they did a lot of like preservatory, like keeping and, not that they were hoarders. They did a lot in terms of embalming and preservation in different ways. That were maybe even more artful than just like mere hoarding, but there is something about it where the hoarding does, you moralize it. I don't know if it's just a justification or an excuse ultimately, I suppose, but it's like you do it because you're like, well, I'm willing to use something that's not doesn't look perfect, because it might, it in your head you think it could be used again.
Yep.
So wouldn't it be wrong of me to give this away when this might be useful in the future, and I wouldn't have to buy something else or whatever.
Yes.
But then you're like, but wait a second, that's feeding into holding on to material things as if they are the answer.
Yes, and then you scapegoat the rich guy who looks to have a lot of stuff, and he's the materialist and I'm not, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. But then you're identifying materialism according to space, what you see, not a relationship to time. And materialism is what happens when you lose faith in yourself. So you need to have the material. You need to have the things. It's a loss of capacity. And so
and definitely a loss of like discernment, because there are certain things, like I think about people who are really good with like preparation, or you could say preppers, right? The term that people use these days is like, are they hoarders? I don't know. Maybe it depends on like the particularity of the situation and their relationship to the things, right?
Yeah.
But there's also a way in which people also, it does seem to be about the discernment element of it.
Very much so. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, you'll notice with many quote-unquote preppers, they have self-systems, they have catalog systems. I mean, it's not like they're just gathering random things. It is all discerned as this is what you would need on day 70, right? Now, you could say that you don't need to do that, and maybe you could say it's not wise, or that's not a good use of deliberate. One should not say that all uses of deliberation are good. The distinction between decision or deliberation and discernment, you could make a discernment, okay, this is what I need to do to destroy the world, right? It is possible
you can
for
discern,
that.
Something that's like bad.
Yeah, that's correct. And that is why the deliberation period is necessary. That's why deliberation matters.
That is an important phase.
It's stuck in deliberation, right? Like, that's why you need the youth. That's why when you're young, you should see people, travel, experience things, so that you have a wide gambit from which to make your absolute choice. And then to start prioritizing and making decisions to move toward this thing, right? And you should be making that by the time you're 25. Now, that's a generality. I'm not going to universalize that, but you are to move from deliberation to discernment, right? So that, that issue on the prepper. Now, the prepper might be like, well, my finances, it's actually not that expensive. I have plenty of room, and it might be perfectly fine for them, right? Well, so you'd have to be that person.
Yeah, and I also do find, though, that people who I would say are like good preppers, or like not hoarder preppers, they are also people who develop skills.
Well, that's what I was about to say.
They literally have skills. They're like, like if crap hits the fan and like
you can't ever hoard enough.
Right.
Preppers know you actually can't ever hoard enough.
No. Exactly, because that can become an autonomous rationality.
Yes, preppers, like true preppers are survivalist, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like the people who do things that are preparatory, or they keep certain things that other people may not, and then you'd have that question of like, are they being materialistic or not, or are they doing this? Is like they at the same time they cultivate skills or have skills.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, I see. They have something in their head about realizing that what they're keeping it wouldn't be a forever solution, but maybe they're thinking, okay, this will get me to this point, by which, like, whatever, hopefully that XYZ I can do this.
Well, I would also say the hoarder's experience with their things tends to be primarily emotional. With the prepper, it's not really an emotional thing. The hoarder can't throw stuff away because this was my daughter's when she was 3.
Yes.
The prepper is like, I can't throw this away because it's useful and I shouldn't. It's not I can't, it's I shouldn't.
Yeah,
The
like
hoarder,
that's the thing. I do think the prepper, the good prepper is discerning.
yeah, absolutely.
discerning,
The hoarder,
given good
what's very
consent.
interesting is materialism, as you're pointing out, is actually far more a certain emotional paralysis than it is
Absolutely.
greed. It is way more
Oh,
emotional paralysis.
Absolutely, but I think this is so important to consider because I think we have a very maybe I think our relationship to our discussion of even like capitalism or
Yeah,
greed
yes,
and all this
yes.
stuff, like I think it's not taking into consideration
No.
what we're discussing right
No,
here.
no.
Because I think that gets us very confused, honestly.
Extremely.
Very confused because then we can only simply think about it in terms of like, is the person able to buy
Yes.
expensive stuff or not?
Yes.
Versus like, what's their orientation toward materiality? Are
Yes.
they like, are they using this as like some emotional crutch, or are they
Yes.
using it as this is toward my passion, or this is toward solving a problem, or this is toward the vision?
Yeah, materialism. I mean,
which can be stuff or no stuff.
yeah,
it's not,
I mean, in that, on materialism, purpose, and discernment, I mean, it's exactly right. Like you would a middle class house in America in say India might be a palace, and you're a greedy materialist. Like if your standard is simply the niceness of the thing, well, that's relative to where you are in the world,
Yeah.
right? So materialism is a certain emotion. I think very often it's exactly what you say. It's an emotional paralysis. It is a certain emotional inability to give up materiality. And that means you're stuck in decisiveness, because materialism is when you can't move to discernment, is what this would
Exactly,
ultimately mean.
exactly.
You can't ever deliberate. You're always in deliberation,
Absolutely.
and you're always
So you're like,
paralyzed.
I'll decide later about
Yes.
which thing, if I should.
Yes, and even if you decide on 5 things, you're so burnt out by the time you get to the 6th that you quit and you never
Yeah,
win.
yeah.
Like when when hoarders try to throw stuff away, they get so exhausted, and it takes them hours to just like do one small corner of the room, and then the next day they bought something else and they're right back to square one. Like that's what I'm saying. Like deliberation will burn out. It will never win.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I was thinking about there was a time when I felt this similar kind of flow of nesting, but at the time it wasn't related to anticipating the birth of a child, but there was a birth that was occurring for me. Just to relate this to like an other like when it comes to it was a particular time when I had to allow something to be birthed from me in like a confessional sense, and I think that was I felt the same sense of like organizing, going through, not being stuck into liberation. You're discerning about like, just doing it and not questioning so much about this, that, or the other, and not being stuck in the emotional paralysis. I guess what I mean to say is why I think that's important is because I do think we're in a particular time where in not maybe allowing ourselves to push ourselves to the place where we will get into a nesting flow, we are very much stuck in our emotional
100%,
paralysis.
100%.
And that leads us back sometimes into the very thing that keeps us from giving ourselves fully to something
Completely.
that then will force us to do the nesting.
Completely.
And I think that's another dimension or like quality of the constant deliberation that then leads you into a place of that emotional paralysis, and at the same time, emotional paralysis comes with the highs of the emotional highs. So that's why you also get stuck there, because you're like, well, I don't want to, people. It's almost like, well, at least there's that perk.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact that you're like not even functioning as a human being because you're so paralyzed by the emotional deliberation space.
Yeah, without the perk, you couldn't rationalize it.
Yeah.
So you have to have the perk, and the perk
Yeah.
makes you then liaisons on the paralysis.
Yeah.
You get enjoyment from it, right?
Yeah. On the hoarder, the perk, I think there's like the ethic, right, of like, or which can be a kind of perk too for the hoarder of like, I am sustainable. Like
I enjoy being someone who wears old clothing because I'm sustaining the environment or something.
Yeah, or like that I'll never get rid of a plastic bag because I might, I can use it and I'm not wasting it.
I'm resourceful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. There's
Which
an
I mean,
enjoyment.
I get, there's like that. There's something there that's like, on the word or causality, you're like, yeah. But then you're like, oh my gosh, that's also could lead to you literally hoarding everything.
But this is getting at, we say all this time, it depends. It depends. It depends. It depends. Yes, it's good here, but that it depends, right?
Yeah.
Unless you move to discernment, you can't make decisions. It's always a depend question. And so you're stuck. Because it depends. So maybe this time, yes, maybe, deliberation, right? But with discernment, you say, no, I don't need another bag.
Yeah.
Yes, I do need another bag. Because you have a standard, right?
100%.
And so if you don't move to deliberation, you're just stuck going back in the maybe. Like, here's the trick. There's no such thing as certainty, right? Except on very general senses of I know I'm experiencing, right? It's useless. There's only confidence, right? The problem of uncertainty, if you are in the realm or stuck in the realm of deliberation, is terrible. But if you have uncertainty and you move to deliberation, then it's manageable. You can manage uncertainty. Because this is B. Does it fall in B or not? I have strong reason to think it doesn't. I don't know for sure, but strong enough reason to think it doesn't that I can throw it away without thinking about it anymore. Right? You don't get certainty, but you can get confidence.
With discernment.
With discernment, yes. And you can get so much confidence that it practically is like certainty because you're just throwing stuff away without thinking about it. You literally don't know. This is what's so wild in the flow state. You actually don't know that you won't need that medicine that you're throwing away in the cabinet, right?
Yeah.
But you actually stop thinking about that.
Yeah.
You practically get certainty even though you technically don't have certainty.
Yes.
And that's when humans find freedom in. That's when you get practical certainty that's not technical certainty. It's like magic. And that's when humans, that's when the problem of uncertainty is not solved, but it's addressed.
Right.
And you suddenly, it's the space of freedom. Because uncertainty is also freedom, right? Because if you knew everything, you wouldn't be free. So uncertainty must be there as a potential problem to create the space of the possibility for freedom. And the only way to address that is to kind of forget uncertainty, which means you get practical certainty, not technical certainty, and that's what happens in freedom flow. That's what happens in nesting. And that's where humans find their fullness.
Yes. No, that was all very good. A quick point when you were saying the word standard, a standard by which, right, for the discernment. I thought that was really interesting because it made me think of the other meaning of, well, it's not the other meaning of standard, it's the same meaning. Yeah. But when people say, like, what's the phrase? Don't you have any standards or something like that, right? Like that that phrase. That concept of standards as, like, what principles do you live by, blah, blah, blah. Like, I do think there's also a real strong correlation when you aren't living by your own standards and having no discernment. Like, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, this is obvious, but there's this transitive property where it's like if you're not having discernment about what your choice, which comes from your choice and honoring that choice, then you don't have a standard by which to keep the papers in your drawer or not. Like, you don't have it over there.
There's only the rationality.
Yeah.
There's no standard against the rationality. Yeah. And so the rationality says keep it. Because it's always silly to get rid of something you might need one day.
But it's weird. It's interesting how those things are related. Like, and this is often discussed in Christianity about, like, the spiritual realm, how it's related to, like, the, what's happening on the spiritual dimension will have impacts in the natural world and stuff like that. But it's like you can't really get yourself to have some sort of standard, or you will not allow yourself to be at the place where you know the standard without having to really think about it, unless you're honoring the initial standards by which you live. Does that make sense? The standards 100%. That are the discernment that are birthed from your choice, right? From that giving over completely.
No, completely. Well, I think what's interesting about the word standard is that it has stand in it. You can't have a standard until you make a stand. And most people say, well, of course. But literally the stand must be an absolute choice. The stand is the thing you choose that is its own grounding that no one but you will live with. You don't people associate taking a stand with moral beliefs or principles. Like, my beliefs are X, so I'm taking a stand for that. That's not a wrong meaning of the term, but the real standard is the absolute choice. The real standard is you don't have a stand. This is the weird thing. You don't have a standard unless you choose something to take over you.
Yep.
And the thing that is your standard is the thing that takes over you.
Yes.
Like, the problem with the word standard is people have made it mean their premise. This is my premise. This is what I believe.
Right.
And therefore I follow it. The key to what we're saying about discernment is the thing you're discerning is a thing over you that works through you, that you give your life over to. You don't have... An algebraic standard is a premise. A geometric standard is a flow.
Yeah.
You see, so your flow, like, I have standards. In a sense, really what you want to say is I have a flow. I have a flow.
Yeah.
This is part of that flow or not, right?
Right.
So when people talk about standards, it tends to still be in the algebraic. That's why it becomes problematic. Really what a human needs is, is the sublation of standard is flow, we could say. Or the freedom flow that we're saying. The thing that is over you. You want a thing over you that you give your life over to, and that's the sublation of standard. But where people, and that's taking a stand. You could say, I'm taking a stand. Well, you take a stand in the place where you can be flowed over, where nesting can occur. So we could put it this way: nesting is a sublation of a standard. Like when people talk, like the problem is people get stuck in quote unquote standard when really they need the sublation of it in nesting. Because what do you do when you nest? Yes, no, throw away yes, keep no. What makes the nest, what doesn't? Yes. A nest is a standard. A nest is a thing that you're materializing, that you're bringing into being.
Yes.
And so what, because like you're building something. Like in another way, your standard is what builds. The sublation of a standard is a construction, is an architecture. Yeah. And so... Like, the problem is we're in a world where people have standards, which is arguably better than them not having standards.
Right.
But if standard is not sublated into nesting, then you're still in deliberation, actually. Because you're basically just... A standard is when you say, well, this is why I choose X instead of Y. But you're actually still in deliberation. You're just navigating deliberations. But you haven't moved to discernment. But it seems like you have because you have a standard. But if you're not nesting, if it's not a flow... then you're actually just... all you have is a heuristic for deliberation. You don't have a way of life by which to discern what aligns with and what doesn't.
Are standards Are they the starting line though for getting to?
Yes, just like deliberation is the starting line for discernment. Standards are not
just
bad.
Getting stuck.
It's all without rationality you're screwed. It's autonomous rationality. It's autonomous deliberation. It's autonomous standard.
Okay. I think okay. So I guess
it's always dialectic. You always have to move to a dialectic.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this sort of problematic dimension of being stuck in the standards, would an example of that be when you say like it's on principle?
Yes.
But you don't. Yes. But you don't necessarily get dialectical of like what does that actually mean for your relationships, or what does that actually look like in... So it's like the standards...
In time.
Yeah. So it's like standards can, if they're not the absolute choice, or...
Yes.
Yeah, then they can be quite blind, or like they can be quite...
Well, they become power, they become dominance, they turn into the norms of Foucault, right?
Right, they can become want and a disavowal of wants, or something like that.
Yes, they can,
in
absolutely.
Standards, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so, yeah, that makes sense. So, it's really, it's about, it's sublation of that.
It's all sublation.
Through the absolute choice to the place of the flow.
Yes.
And therefore in that flow, you know your standard, right?
Yes.
You know, like, there's just that discernment of like, yes, no, keep, yes, no.
And the standard in a way is not yours. It's over you. Like, that's the other difference.
It's higher.
Like, standard, they're higher than you. Is nesting, like, when nesting is your standard, is it yours? Right. The word standard, like we said, want is impoverished. The word standard becomes kind of impoverished.
Yeah.
It doesn't really capture it, right? It's alignment. It begins moving toward Aristotle. It's more of alignment than it is standard. Right. And so you could say that the sublation of standard is alignment.
Yeah.
But alignment is an interesting word because what are you aligned with? It's beyond you, right? Mm-hmm. but a standard is yours. Standard is something you possess, or the word more lends itself in that direction, right? But again, it's all dialectical, because it's not like literally when you make the absolute choice, of course you're going to go to friggin' Food Lion and deliberate between Folgers coffee or not, right? But what will happen is the deliberations are much easier. You go by, and you also know it doesn't matter, so you can make a choice. That's the other key. You'll still have deliberation in your life when you discern, but the deliberations don't bother you as much. You're quicker.
You don't get stuck
emotionally
stuck in the deliberation.
Just like you'll still have rationality with non-rationality. It's just that rationality no longer gets you stuck.
Yeah.
And stuck is a space word. And time is never stuck. Note that. Yeah. Time never gets stuck. Only space. And so when you're temporal, you don't get stuck anymore.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I think too, we often like to pretend sometimes that we should still be deliberating.
Yes.
When we actually know what to do.
100%.
And we just don't want to do it because it's scary or it's hard or whatever.
And also too, when people don't have discernment, they can sometimes actually kind of moralize deliberation and make extend periods of deliberation just because it feels meaningful. This is the other problem. Like if you don't have the meaning of flow, then what feels meaningful to you is deliberation. But then guess what another form of deliberation is? Drama. Drama is deliberation at an intensity, right? And so this is where people seek drama or actually look forward to drama. They'll never say that, but they actually create drama because it creates a feeling of stakes. Deliberation creates a feeling of stakes.
Yeah.
And so people actually will constantly put themselves in places of deliberation to feel like their life has stakes, which then eventually boils over into drama.
Yep.
Right? So this is, this issue has, stakes. Because, if you don't move to discernment keeps you out of drama.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. 100%.
Deliberation is how you end up in drama all the time.
But then you could kind of feel like, it's like when people will talk about, well, that's good, it's real, we're fighting,
that's right.
Blah, blah,
that's
blah.
Right.
It's like, I mean...
But it's free, it's deliberation, choice, I'm free, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing, right? So yay to nesting, Michelle.
Well, I'm really happy we talked about this because I think the illustration that one can see and witness and maybe even experience with nesting as it relates also to not only the biological experience but the creative act is quite helpful.
Yes.
And quite interesting. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're in an age, if you talk about autonomous rationality, that's a quote-unquote masculine mistake, which is the mistake of hoarding. Mm-hmm. And rationality, again, is weak without truth. So, and for Freud, when he associated rationality with masculinity, that just meant men were better at rationalizing. Mm-hmm. They were more deluded, actually. Whereas women are true nesting, but then the era of women is something like empty nesting. Or hysteria because they're taken over. They give themselves over to something that doesn't form a nest. It just becomes hysterical, right? That's what Freud talked about. So so what you get, and this is where capitalism is hoarding and gathering everything, is such a problem. But then of course the error of nesting that then over identifies with the nest, because here's the problem: you can nest, but then you won't give the nest up.
Well, yeah, like we said, I mean,
you don't nest the nesting. You don't nesting the nest, I suppose.
Well, then nests are transient. They will come and they will go. It's not.
But the woman refuses to accept that. That's when she gets into trouble.
I think that's where you have the quote unquote empty nest syndrome. It's like you didn't let that.
Yes.
You didn't let the nest. Fall into its.
Well, in a sense, empty nest is when you don't nest the nest. Per se, there's no nesting of the nest in a way, right? Because nesting has this cleaning out sort of idea.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's the thing. Those little parts, those little bits of the nest, they usually, if you look at birds' nests, sometimes they'll sort of stay together, but often also other birds can come, or the wind blows or whatever, and all those little parts, they're just scattered again. And they become material again. Maybe it becomes another nest.
Yes,
maybe it's used for a mouse home or something.
But that's when you accept the temporal.
Exactly.
Not the space.
Yeah. I do think that the fixedness and the element of control makes us later on feel out of control.
Completely.
And that's what a lot of times those are the types of languaging that you get with empty nest, not syndrome, but people who are experiencing the empty nest. in a difficult way.
Yeah.
It feels like things are out of control. Like they've lost something of their personhood or their identity, and they can't get it back, and they wish they could somehow.
Happens with artists who, like, they finish the novel and they're successful, but then they have nothing else. They have an empty nest syndrome in the same, because it's like an empty muse syndrome, an empty mind syndrome almost. And they go nuts.
And it's like, that wouldn't be empty if you just let that dissipate.
Yeah.
Which is so hard, because you're like, no, it's the nest, it's the thing, it has all of the, it's the shirt with the memories, right? The sweet little polo shirt my 3-year-old wore, or whatever. Well, but it's not, that isn't the essence of it. That's not really the thing that is ultimately what you're doing it all for.
Correct.
What you're doing it all for is, it is ultimately for the relations themselves, for the people themselves, for what is allowed to move through those spaces, the time that will naturally progress things through those spaces, the time space of it all.
But that's also why you should choose that and discern everything on that. And the nest and the books and everything is for that. Like the entire unfolding of the thing and all the relationships and all the experiences and all that come from it, right? And what you're doing in the absolute choice is you're saying, I'm choosing the fullness of this path that is aligned with, say, writing books or having children, come what may.
Yeah.
And I am identifying with that come what may, and I'll be prepared for it, and I'll have the skills, and I'll be ready for it, and I'll be able to discern how to have that come what may be beautiful. And that's primarily what you're choosing.
Yeah.
The situation more than just the thing. The story versus just a chapter. But it's been a pleasure.
Been a pleasure, babe. I always love talking with you.
I love talking with you. For more,
yes.
OG Rose, please check out YouTube, Instagram, Amazon, and Anchor. All books on Amazon. If you pick one up, is appreciated. Reviews. And good talking to you, hon.
Oh, yes. Always a pleasure, babe. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank y'all.